Now, don't turn your video off just yet so that you can do this exercise with the rest of us. I'm just inviting you all to reach sideways in your picture and hold each other's hands, as it were. I think, Yunka, you need to put, that's it, lovely. So that we feel like we're holding hands in a circle.
That's good.
And then look to the right and to the left, so that you're acknowledging each other as best we can. Yeah? Lovely. Well done, everyone. So in a way, what I'm inviting you to do is picture yourself in a rather large meeting space, meeting hut, telling stories to each other and listening to each other's stories and seeing what sense we can make of each other's stories. A lot of people have mentioned some of the things I'll be talking about. This is not, well, it is, and it's not a profound workshop. It does touch on some very profound stuff, but I want us to feel creative and playful and enjoy ourselves together as a group as we see the absolute richness of stories. And it's really been a really interesting journey, this one for me, because usually I do a workshop mind map and that's it. This must be about the 5th or 6th mind map I've done, and I've got one down here which is 4 times the size of those. And then I decided I had to tidy it up a bit more because the story felt like one of these, like the Odyssey or something like that, where you've got story upon story upon story. And I was saying to Yinka, I had to kind of condense it somehow. So I'm going to screen share, and there's not going to be a lot of screen sharing because it doesn't fit with telling stories really, but hopefully, oops, it's disappeared. Isn't that typical? Ah, right. Okay. So we had, must be, okay. Okay. Let's see what I can do about bringing up my desktop. Okay. Oh, goodness me. Yunka and I tried this before, and obviously something goes wrong, doesn't it, with the dashboard? Bother it. Okay. Okay. Oops, there we go. Let's get it open. Right. Okay. Can people see that? No, presumably.
Not yet.
Not yet. Okay. Let me just get rid of that. Okay. Ah, that's better, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. Now I'm going to.
Still can't see anything, Enid.
Oh, goodness. Right. Okay, let's try again. If not, I shall give up.
That's it.
Okay. Thank you, whoever that was. That's really helpful. Okay, so there isn't a lot. It's just to give me a bit of structure because, as I say, I think that too much screen sharing isn't helpful at this time. Just want to talk a bit about ground rules, which won't be unfamiliar to any of you. Confidentiality, I really would like you to feel free when you go in breakout rooms to feel able to talk and share together. So the answer then is that you keep confidential whatever is shared, and that you use self-care in that you only share what of your own story is important and relevant and you know you're safe to do. Time structuring, well, of course, it's more or less fixed on Zoom, isn't it? You can't, no group can carry on talking when the timing finishes and the breakout room closes. So there's a kind of somewhat dictatorial process, really. But hopefully you will all feel you can share the time adequately within the breakout rooms. One of the breakout exercises I'm allowing quite a bit of time for. So hopefully that'll work out okay. I'm aiming, I put breaks. We will have at least one long break, but if you feel desperate to have a break, will you please shout up? Okay, because put your hand up or put it in the chat. Because I have endless energy and I tend to just carry on. But I'm determined we have good breaks because we really need it in this format, I find. And I'm hoping that the time in the breakout rooms doing the exercises will be energizing for you and won't feel so much like this, or just sitting in front of the screen stuck. When you've got questions or comments, but particularly questions, put them in the chat room and maybe stick your hand up, but Yinka will pick up what seems important to deal with right now. Okay, so that's the best we can do, but hopefully we'll be able to allow for some discussion by that means. Okay, so why the workshop? To a large extent, we've already covered it. I do believe, like somebody said, we slightly underestimate the power of narrative in TA, even though we do script stories in training. And one of the things I recognize is that we don't always pick up the signs that somebody's in a story and that actually they're telling us their story. And so I love, as a supervisor and as a trainer, and in my work, in my practice, to really pick up those little clues. So like when a client says to me frequently, oh, it's been a terrible week, everything, and I say, so what's been terrible? Oh, it's like everything's crashed down on my head. And I'm like, that is so incongruous. That cannot be the real experience. And of course, it's all a story that is true for generations of women in her family, but the story itself is keeping her stuck. So that's the thing about the power of narrative. It's the power of narrative to free us, but there's also the power of narrative to really keep us stuck. And we know about that with script beliefs and so on. Detecting. One of the things about looking for intergenerational stuff and for understanding somebody's story is looking for those clues. And we're going to do a little bit of just touching on the theme of what would be the clues we see in people that gives us a picture of what the story is. As we tell stories, I do believe we feel our whole family ancestors around us. And in my case, I feel they're there supporting me, which is probably why I have such good energy, I suspect. But that's because human beings have always told stories. And one of the joys for me is that stories across the world, I mean, I've got a book just behind me of African folk stories. You know, you see stories repeated in countries where you wouldn't think they could ever be, that the same story could have been spoken by the same person, but somehow different cultures develop the same story. Essentially, it's the same, obviously. The food that people get or the magical implements may be different, but the quality of the story, the essential elements of it, are actually the same. And to me, that's just absolutely amazing. And the other thing that I'm passionate about is that reframing somebody mentioned, of using narrative as a route to change, both the lived narrative and the spoken narrative and what we tell ourselves. So basically, that's why you can tell I'm very excited about all of this. Okay, we're not quite at that point yet.
Enid, we have a question about the recording.
Yes.
Is the recording of this being shared outside of the group? What happens to it?
That's a good question. What did they say when they were talking about it? I think it's mostly the group members who will get it. I'm not sure. Do you know, David?
Yeah, so the plan was to make the recordings available generally on the reattendance platform. So if you're a delegate to the conference, you can go and view the recordings there. So other groups will be able to see the recording.
Yes, so if you're anxious about sharing something, do it in the breakout room, which won't be recorded. Is that okay for the person who asked the question?
She's nodding, so it's, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So one of the reasons I got so into story, I think, is I had a deprived childhood. Everybody in my generation had a deprived childhood because I was born when the war started. Tells me you're my age. and paper was in short supply. So my father was an avid reader, but he had an awful lot of engineering books. So I ended up reading things like The Jungle Story and all sorts of books that were way beyond my capacity. So when books came in, it was so exciting. And one of the first books we were given as children was Czechoslovakian folk stories. And I could even now tell, in fact, I frequently quote the story of the wooden baby in therapy, the child that never could be satisfied and ended up eating the people who made him. It was a pretty awful story, but there's something about that endless satisfaction, endless need that some people have. That story of the wooden baby and the destructiveness of it, if you keep feeding it, is a perfect comparison for some people to help them stop and think, "Ooh, what am I doing here?" And then I actually did an English degree. And in the English degree, one of the things I think I really learned was spotting themes in books. So I have ever since been quite good at spotting themes in people's lives, which I think is part of my excitement about narrative. And I think anybody can learn to do that, but I think I had a head start because of that. Why do I think stories are so important? So again, some people have mentioned this. They bypass the parent. They're non-shaming. So if I talk to somebody about the wooden baby and tell them a story, or tell them the story of Naaman, the Assyrian general, I was brought up very much on Bible stories, so forgive me, but this one's such a good one for someone who's looking to do really difficult things in life and doesn't value it unless it's really difficult. Naaman developed leprosy, and he had a little slave girl from Israel who said to him, his wife, "If only my master could go to the prophet in Israel, he would be able to make him well of the leprosy." So Naaman goes along with his big gifts for the prophet Elijah. And when he gets there, Elijah simply says to him, "Go and bathe 3 times in the River Jordan, and then you'll be well of your leprosy." And Naaman's like, "We have beautiful, clear rivers in Jordan, in Assyria. Why would I want to bathe in that mucky old Jordan River?" So he refuses initially to do it. And his second in command says to him, "Master, if the prophet asked you to do something really difficult and dangerous, you would do it. Why not just give it a go?" So he does, and of course he's made well. But that's such a lovely story for people who believe that unless something is really difficult, it's not going to work. I use that one a lot when I'm persuading people to try tapping, because it's much too easy and it works too easily. So, stories are such a lovely resource. And as I say, they bypass that possible shaming, because people realizing it without you having to directly confront it is a gentle, playful confrontation that can be heard by the child that made the script. So that's one of the lovely things about stories, that they're a very safe way to work as long as you're very careful, as illustrations. I have to put Byrne in somewhere, don't I? So it's one of Byrne's therapeutic operations, illustration. And if neatly used, a story can be a wonderful illustration. So I'll just do some more screen share. Let's hope it works again. Here we go again. Isn't this annoying? Here we go. That's it. Okay. So it's interesting. I don't know if anybody knows about, can people see it?
No.
Yeah.
Oh dear. I never know why it does this, because yeah. Nope. Okay. Let's try again. If not, I'll probably just give up on the screen share, the PowerPoint, because it's probably, let's give it one more go. Dear. No, no. I think it's something to do with the, oh, that's it. Let's see if I can. It's something to do with the way it works with, yeah, well, never mind. Let's give it a go and see. Is that any better?
Nope, not
No.
yet.
Okay, so we give up on it, which means I hope I remember everything. Okay, so I'll just, Christopher Booker wrote a book in 2004, which said there were just 7 basic plots. Overcoming monsters, rags to riches, the quest, death and rebirth, various things. They sort of narrowed them down. But to me, stories are so universal and so broad that actually there's no limit to the number of the different kinds of themes that come up. And in my experience, almost everything is covered by a legend or a story. And almost all of them, many of them start with trauma. So you think about all the great heroes of old. If you think about the Greek myths, you've got Jason and the Argonauts. Jason's uncle, I think it was, had stolen his father's kingdom, and he tried to get it back. And this guy says, "Oh, you can have it back if you go and get the golden fleece," thinking he'll never come back. So but it starts with his father having had his kingdom taken off him and being killed. It starts with a trauma and a war and a destruction and a deprivation. The stories of Hercules, which I think are most peculiar, because often in the Greek and Roman legends, the gods get involved, and the gods are worse than normal people, actually. And so Heracles is the son of one of the high up gods, and his wife, the god's wife, gets really furious that Heracles has been born at all, and makes his life hell, really, basically. And part of having to do all these things like clearing out the Augean stables, which had just become part of legend, hasn't it? Those stories are really well known, but they're part of the punishment of the gods for Hercules. And yet the thing that interests me when you look at the ancient heroes is that they don't focus on that deprivation. And we'll be talking a bit more about that later, because many of them start with a broken attachment or a non-attachment, but actually their focus is on moving forward and finding their way into their life and performing their quest and whatever their goal is. So it's really interesting to think about what is trauma. People have talked a lot about trauma. And, you know, I think it'd be interesting for us to think, what do we think of as trauma? Did we think of lockdown as trauma? Do we still think of what we've been through as trauma? Many people talk of it as trauma. But I think people's experience of trauma is fascinating according to where their belief system is. I will never forget the client I had in Strangeways. I used to work in the probation service with people who had mental health problems. And this guy was very paranoid, but unfortunately the psychiatrist thought he was just a personality disorder. So we couldn't rescue him from a prison sentence. So when the Strangeways riots happened and he was in there, I was really worried for him, because I knew he lived in a world where everybody was against him. and where obviously there was a lot of fear and, you know, attack in his psyche. The stories that he told himself in his craziness were, you know, of people attacking. So I thought, what must it be like to be in Strangeways when all that riot is going on? And it was quite terrifying for those people who remember it. It was exceptional in Britain. And he got shipped out, as did a lot of the other prisoners, to Preston, I think it was. And I went to see him in Preston. And I said to him, I've been really concerned for you. Talk about being put in your place. He looked me straight in the eye and he said, well, it's what was going to happen anyway. And he wasn't at all perturbed by it, because in his mind, this is what his life was, and he was ready for it. So he didn't experience it as a trauma, because he was constantly living anyway with this belief that people were against him. There was a plot continually against him. So it didn't affect him at all, whereas other people were traumatized for years afterwards by the experience. So a lot of it's about how do we see it and how do we see ourselves in that process. So I'm going to invite you to go into breakout rooms. Now, let me just see, how many of us are there? Oh, it says there are 21 participants. Does that include me and you, Yinka, do you think? Yeah?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, you need to exclude myself into a quick chat with you.
Unless you wanted to go in, but yes, okay.
Just exclude me.
So I think if we try, we'll try 6 breakout rooms. Whew, let's hope this works. Oh dear, more, here we go. Breakout rooms. And now I need to tell you what the task is. Now, I was going to show you this on PowerPoint, but because PowerPoint won't work, I will have to tell you. So that's very annoying. It won't work for that, at least. I'd like you first to talk together about what you think of as trauma, how you see trauma. And then in each of, there should be 3 of you in the breakout room. Each of you, sorry about the umming, it's because I haven't got my PowerPoint. Each of you take turns to talk about the story you tell yourself and other people about your lockdown experience. And I'm going to invite the other people in the breakout room to listen with care and pick up the themes and ask yourselves, what kind of story is this? And is it an energizing story, or is it a story that actually contributes to trauma? And what's the other bit? I should have written this down just in case. I didn't have my paranoid head on when I did this PowerPoint. Yes, the final bit is, if you were to tell that story to a child as a bedtime story, what would be the effect of it? Do you want me to go through that again? So first of all, have a discussion together about what you see as trauma. Don't get too technical. Just think of it experientially. And then each of you take turns to tell your lockdown story as you would tell it to others, but also as you tell it to yourself. And the others listen with care and see whether you think this is an energizing story. Is it a tragedy? Is it a comedy? Is it a hopeful story? Is it a negative story? And then the final bit is, if you told that story to a child as a bedtime story, what would be the effect of it? Okay, everybody got that?
How long have we got for the exercise, please, Enid?
25 minutes. I don't want to rush you. What I will do is pop in and out of the odd breakout room just to see how it's going. Okay, so I think 25 minutes should be more than enough for all of that, but it's quite a lot, obviously. So that brings. Are there any questions people are dying to ask after that exercise, or did you just get a lot from it? We haven't time for everybody to feed back, but I could tell you were all really going at it very effectively and very compassionately with each other.
One of the things we were talking about is the discomfort of there not being a resolution or a happy ending, particularly when thinking about retelling the story to a child, and what happens to that child, or thinking of us, our child ego states, when there isn't a resolution, where it leaves us, how it feels.
Well, I think that's a really good point, actually. And I guess if you were retelling it to a child, you'd be talking about how much people had worked to keep themselves safe. And because I tend always to do balance, I would be talking about the good things that have come out of it. And it's very interesting for me because I'll just share this with you, so I don't want anybody to get all upset, but during lockdown, my sister's been moved into a home with dementia, and I have, well, thank God she's in there, and I've discovered the value of my brother, which I didn't know before, which really makes me feel very touched. But also my husband was very ill and he died. But we had the most amazing experience of the generosity and kindness of people. So I don't see it as a trauma. I see it as a normal rite of passage. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to put the workshop on, because I thought this is so interesting. It isn't that I don't miss, obviously, my husband or feel sad about my sister, but there's something about how I manage that and how what I tell to my child, which doesn't feel cruel or unkind, but very compassionate. And I have discovered the absolute delight of being fit and well and able to enjoy the great outdoors, which has always been important for me. But I think I'm incredibly gifted to have that. So, you know, I think that's such a good story of how it's like this. And I do know a lot of people, somebody was talking about they discovering the pleasure of her own company. And I certainly have a client who discovered during lockdown that she is definitely a very highly sensitive individual for whom too much stimulus is too much. So during lockdown, she's discovered that a working pattern that means she's not forever in the office is wonderful. So much of it is how we tell ourselves and the stories we tell ourselves and how accepting we are of those stories. I think that's the other bit, isn't it? Yeah. But yes, it's true. Some stories are open-ended, aren't they? But I always think with those traditional fairy stories, the ones that we all know, like Cinderella, well, how boring. And if you pick up the book of politically correct fairy stories, I don't know if it's in that one or the other one, where Cinderella gets so bored, she goes into the kitchen just to go and have something interesting to do. And then all the other court ladies come and join her. So it's almost like that's a way of redoing the story that I think is really helpful. So any other thoughts?
I just wanted to say that it was quite interesting when we were telling our stories that although things were happening beyond our control, it seems to me that each of us had some kind of autonomy. And I just remember the story about the matchstick girl, which is the complete opposite, that she's so poor and she dies in the snow. And the only thing that saves her is the God, or she sees in the clouds the face of God. I can't remember exactly how it went, but to me, that's the exact opposite of a good story. I actually hate that story.
Me too. I love it. The other one is the story of the person who was so proud she didn't want to mess her shoes up, so she stood on bread to walk over a puddle and then sunk down to hell. After, I think that was a Hans Christian Andersen one. I decided to ban that book to my children because they were just too awful. And it is true that some legends and fairy stories, I never know where Hans Christian Andersen got here. Some of them are so awful. I don't think they are they're so moral, some of them too, that I don't think they come in the collection of ancient stories. It's interesting, really, to think, you know, in fact, one of the slides I couldn't do was about, well, so why did people tell these stories? Well, you can tell why he told those. It's about inculcating moral behavior, which, so scaring children with a story, which is awful, awful. But there are others where they definitely are trying to promote behavior. But if you think about Beowulf, the story of, I don't know if people know that because I did Anglo-Saxon as part of my English degree. You know, Beowulf goes and kills this Grendel, the monster who's come into the hall and grabbed two of his companions. And that's a story that's really about supporting your community and supporting your clan. So, you know, he's held up as the great hero because he's done that. And there are loads of stories like that, but they don't feel as horrible as the little match girl or the person who stood on the loaf of bread. Somehow feels more acceptable. And those, of course, were folk myth. And stories were used to convey all sorts of messages. That was one of the slides I didn't get. Let's see if we can get it a minute. Do you want to do it, Yinka? Since yours seems to. Yinka can screen share and she's got my PowerPoint now, so. Do you want, Yeah, okay, so it's about here, I think. Yeah, it's, next one. That's it, yes. You know, some stories were used to inspire people to bravery and they would have been told to children. Some of them, like, I don't know if people know the Anansi stories, but they're much loved in the West Indies, but mostly they originated in Africa. And they're just to make you laugh, really, Anansi's crazy ways of trying to get his own way all the time. And then you've got some that teach wisdom. So I can't remember if it's Catskin or Kappa Rushes. One of them is that story that's in King Lear, where the father invites his three daughters to say how much he loves her. And it's Kappa Rushes, says, I love you as much as fresh meat loves salt. And she gets exiled, just like King Lear and Cordelia. And at the end, of course, he's invited to her marriage feast when it all comes right. And she says to the cook, don't put salt in any of the dishes. And the cook says, that'll be rare and nasty. I love that phrase. But of course, her father starts eating the feast and starts crying because he suddenly realizes how much fresh meat needs salt and it all comes right. But that's to teach the wisdom of not expecting, some of them are about the folly of age. Some of them are about the wisdom of age. There's a lovely African one about a guy in time of famine who fights death and ends up as a rain cloud when death finally manages to kill him, but he's killed death as well. And some are used to give hope. So they are actually quite intentional, but I suppose they're so much embedded in what community values. They're just about encouraging community values. And if you think about some of the stories we've enjoyed during lockdown, not just our own, but those of other people and the things people have done, which have been quite inspiring, I suppose maybe some of them will become modern myths or modern legends like Captain Tom, you know, and other people who did the exceptional in the best way they could within the lockdown rules. And that is all about autonomy, isn't it? It's like I do what I'm able rather than thinking of myself as curtailed. Can you stop the screen share, Yinka? No, thank you. That's great. It's a good job Yinka's more organized than me on these things. So did anybody tell a story that was about being lacking autonomy? Oh, good. I thought was good, healthy TA people. You wouldn't be so likely to throw away your autonomy like that. I haven't even bothered about the rules. I've never broken any, I don't think. But I've always thought, well, I'll do what's sensible. And so I've been careful because I don't want the virus, and I certainly don't want to spread it around. So it's interesting, isn't it? But I have heard a lot of people talking as if they were bowed down by this military authority. And so the question then comes for me of, what is that about? You know, is that something that's come down as a family heirloom, this idea that, you know, because some people have entered into this feeling of being imprisoned. And as someone who works a lot with systemic stuff, I then do start to think, oh, is it possible that somebody in their family system did have that experience and somehow it hasn't been cleared? And we'll be talking about that later. But what I wanted to go back to, which I nearly missed out from my mind map, is how we recognize stories. You know, people were talking about working with clients and what have you. One of the ways I recognize stories is I catch a phrase and I think that doesn't make sense. I don't know if any of you were talking in that way, but it's like it's not in tune with the reality they're describing. Like the person I was saying talked about everything crashing down on them. I think you can, so you can see it in the language, and there is a really good book, which Alexandra would probably know, which actually is about historical trauma by Mark Wallam. I'll put that in the chat next time we have a breakout, all right? And he talked quite a lot about the key phrases that you notice. And I think, you know, you can often hear in people's language and the way they describe things, something that is interesting and isn't the phrase you might use. And it's worth then, I think, pursuing that and seeing what kind of story does it seem to be describing. The other way I think it really comes out is in body language. And so if somebody's walking around like this, yeah, they're going to feel, they're living their story of misery, aren't they? And we know ourselves, you know, that when we let ourselves do that, just changing our body language immediately helps us get in touch with a different story. And I will often do that with clients, not brusquely like I did just then, but it's a way of feeling your way into it and seeing how you can couch it in a story that maybe can be tweaked gently and slowly. And the other question I often ask is, so how does this way of thinking or this way of describing it help you? Is it enhancing? Does it leave you feeling good? If you told it to a child, how would the child experience that? I also pick it up in an ego image quite often. I don't know if other people see ego images. This is good TA stuff, isn't it? But I love in supervision to get people to think, well, who in, you know, if this person was in a play, what would come up for you? And so much can come from that about the person's story that can then be used therapeutically in the work with them. Because there are some stories that are so unhelpful and unhealthy for us to go on living. I think that was it. Yeah.
Enid, can I ask a quick question?
Mm,
When you say ego images, do you mean the fantasies, the images that you have in response to what's being said or shared by the client?
Yes, I did once have, this is probably my strongest memory of getting one in a session. Often I think about it afterwards rather than in the session, but sometimes, just occasionally, a really strong impression comes to me in the session. And I had this guy, again in probation, I don't know why I'm using so many probation examples today, but I kept seeing Humpty Dumpty. And I was so embarrassed, I thought, I cannot. And I wanted to giggle. It was really weird. And I kept seeing this for several sessions. And in the end, I had to say to him, I'm really sorry. I just have to tell you about this. I mean, I knew him quite well by that point. And I said, I really just need to tell you that I keep seeing this enormous egg like Humpty Dumpty getting ready to crash. And it was interesting because what emerged, and I hadn't even done constellational systemic work at that point, but what emerged as we talked about that, thankfully, wasn't offended by my image. And he was the only child who survived out of 8 brothers. He was the one child in his family that had survived. And he kept trying to live for 8, basically, which was where this image kept coming from. But only he could have explained that to me. I couldn't understand this image, but it was there so strongly. They were so big and solid, but so vulnerable. And of course, the offence for which he'd been in court was actually connected to this, all this stuff, this story he was living of having to be super person. And he hadn't even thought about these dead siblings. But there was something about him having to be the super person. So yeah, that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Yeah. The other thing you'll often see is you can pick out the elements of a story. So there was a client again in probation, I'll call her Elsie, who had 4 children. When I visited her, because we had to do probation visits, home visits, she had the most beautiful, neat, tidy house, clearly lived a sort of very traditional middle-class life. And yet she had taken drugs in to prison to one of the most notorious drug users in the area. And it didn't match at all. I mean, it was so incongruous. And the risk she'd put her kids at of being without their mother, because taking drugs into prison is a major, major offense. And in fact, she got a suspended prison sentence, which was a very, very good outcome. But when we talked about what the hell was she thinking about, not quite in those terms, but what emerged was she started talking about her husband, the father of the 4 kids, and how she, when they first got together, she used to get up and go and chop wood for the fire. And it was like she was living in a primitive fairy story where the woman did everything for the man. She wasn't living in the 20th century. And she began to realize that she'd been living this weird fantasy, which is why she agreed to take these drugs in. She wasn't that emotionally involved with this guy, and yet she was completely out of touch with reality and discounting to such a high level about what she was doing. So one of the other questions I thought we should think about is, when we come across a story that people are living, where does the point come where we've got the right to interfere? You know, what is it that gives us the right to interfere? Because sometimes we're very happy with our stories. And sometimes our stories seem to work for us. And I think about Finita English, who always said, what would I do without my script? Why should I completely change my script? And yet we know there are many people that are better off to change their script or tweak it in some way or find other aspects to it. But I think the question with clients, if this person likes to think of themselves as highly successful, and yet we see they've had to be the grown-up in their family all these years, At what point is it right to point out the discounts? I mean, I have my own answers, but I'm interested in whether other people have thoughts that come to their minds. Because I think sometimes, you know, like this super guy, I had every right to help him change his story because obviously it got him into trouble with the law. So that's simple, isn't it? You know, so if people are carrying a story that damages their lives and puts them at such risk, of course it's okay to change it.
It's so nuanced, isn't it? Because it doesn't have to be that the whole story is deconstructed. It can be the same general story with a different, taking a different path, or with a bit of an enhancement. It can be, I like being this character, however, this character gets me in trouble. So maybe it's the permission to slightly alter the character, keep the parts that are useful and helpful, and give permission to put down the parts that aren't helpful. I don't think you can ever, like you just said about Finita English, how would I be? Wouldn't know how to live in the world if I wasn't the person that I know that I am, living in the world that I know. You have to do these things gently and slowly and mold it rather than throw it away and be left with nothing.
Well, maybe it's about treasuring the things that work for us and that leave us to a truly happy and contented life. One of the books I liked best when I was a kid, as I say, I had an odd selection, was a book called Out of Doors with Nomad. And the children in the book, it was basically a learn about plants and things and birds kind of book. But every chapter you went out with it, they went out with Nomad and they saw this or they saw that or the other. I still love the natural world. I'm passionate about it. And it's always been a great solace to me. So, of course, that's a really healthy part of my script that keeps me well, physically well, that's good for the environment. I've introduced my grandchildren to it, my children, you know, it's like it works. So that I wouldn't want to change that. Other things like trying to protect my sister from looking stupid, which was part of my early script, and which never worked because now she has dementia, very interesting process, were not at all helpful to me and got me into some difficulties as I mounted up my TA career. So it's interesting, isn't it, working out what is it that's life enhancing and how do we decide that, and how do we carefully not judge and criticize people without inquiring, I suppose. I mean, I think it's easy when people are in trouble with the law or when things are always crashing down on your head and this client every week is in the same state of misery. To me, I'm like, I can't bear this. And if I can't bear it, as far as I'm concerned, I feel I got the right to try and get them out of it, especially since they're in therapy. You know, it's like, so what are we doing here? I don't feel I want to keep you stuck. So any other thoughts on that? That was really helpful. And it's like, it doesn't have to be one or the other, does it? But it's about working out.
It's that moment when the client asks, why am I here again? Why is this happening again to me?
Absolutely.
And that's when you can come in.
Yes. Well, I suppose the question after that is, and do you want it to keep happening? And I think this, I'm aware that we haven't, not everybody here is therapists, are they? You're organizational, aren't you, David? No.
No, I'm a therapist.
Are we all therapists? I didn't ask that. Is anybody not a therapist or counsellor? Okay, good. Oh, well, that's all right. I don't have to too much account the people who aren't. But I think it's true, organizations, you actually see organizations. Oh, here I am again. So I think it does apply there as well. But yes, I think that does give you permission, doesn't it? It's like when do they feel the discomfort is so much? But I think you do often come up with loyalty conflicts, which we'll be talking about later. Okay, so I'm now looking at my attachment little mind map.
Can I just ask, Enid, you were mentioning somebody called Ursula Frank, and I didn't catch what that was about.
Just about to stick it into the chat. Just give me 2 seconds.
No, but is it something that we're going to be talking about, or was it just an
Yes.
aside?
Yes, it's about her book is about working with transgenerational trauma in individual settings, and the exercise that I'm going to do at the end, the demonstration I'm going to do, some of it comes from her book. So, because the traditional way of working with transgenerational stuff was always in a constellations workshop, so in a group setting. But various people over the years have worked on ways to do it individually. And some of her stuff and some of the stuff in Mark Warnham's book, which again is in the chat, is very useful to use as a practical way in to helping people deal with this sort of stuff that comes from the family. So I'm just going to sort of wander around a little bit. I don't know how else to describe it, but wander around the issue of attachment. We've already touched on it. I think our attitude to lockdown and this kind of thing, it does bring up our attachment styles. And I think in many ways during lockdown, one of the things that I've noticed is those of us who are a bit on the schizoid side have had chance to indulge that and have more of it. And people who are more gregarious have found it really difficult. So everybody's had to, I think we've tended to become more of ourselves, because I suppose it's because we haven't had those distractions that we normally have of the structure of our weeks and the way things normally work out for us. I usually go dancing twice a week. I miss my dance group. They're the few people that aren't so good at communicating online. And meeting family and this kind of thing. So we've been thrown much more on our own resources. And my observation is people have become almost sometimes a bit like caricatures of themselves, and had to kind of work on themselves and work out, well, what am I learning from this and what's useful to me in this experience? So I think we have come down to our life positions, really. It's really thrown up our life positions. You know, and what is it like to feel afraid for our life and so on, and to feel, do we feel okay about other people, and how have we felt compassion for other people who now present a risk to us, or, you know, were presenting a risk to us. So there's all sorts of existential issues that have emerged, aren't there, during lockdown? And I know you touched on that, some of you, in your lockdown stories. But I think also what's come up is more of our sense of how we are connected to people and what those connections are about. So one of the things for me is that I felt really close and understanding of my parents and how they had to manage the war and all those things that suddenly started being thrust on them by authorities without them choosing it, you know, and having to move here or there, or manage without this or without that. And I've certainly felt a lot more compassion and understanding of my mother's rationing of everything. She always rationed everything to make sure we all had enough. We never went hungry, but I always felt she was mean. I now understand it differently. There's just something about this process. I've had time to feel much more connected to them and to my grandparents who went through the First World War and presumably the flu, the Spanish flu epidemic, and, you know, what must have been like for them. So there's something for me that's been very healing and steadying about feeling their experiences behind me, supporting me, that I don't feel totally alone with it. So that's one way in which I've connected with a part of my story that I found positively helpful. So that's been interesting for me. So if we think about the stories that people tell each other, some of the model stories in legends are more challenging in terms of attachments, because there are loads of stories about children who suddenly don't have the support of parents. And the number of stories that start with siblings being sent out to earn their living or find their way in the world. And, you know, you can, the mother makes them a journey cake or a Johnny cake. And you can either have it, half of it with my blessing, or you can just have the whole of it. And the choices they make about whether they go with mother's blessing, which means, of course, they have that sense of attachment and approval from mother. And it's always the one who takes the half cake with mother's blessing who makes their way in the world. And the other thing that emerges a lot in stories is the helpers. So, you know, people go out to find their place and find who they are. And the people who are kind and have an I'm okay, you're okay way of doing things, they get magical helpers, which is an interesting, almost political kind of thing, isn't it? But may or may not be the case. But it's a way of promoting the message. Always be kind to people, always be helpful. But in the middle of all that, what gets discounted, and I think this is what can happen in our own stories, we can discount crucial elements. So I'm going to tell you the story of Molly Whipple, which I always thought of in a way, until I started really reflecting on it, as a story of a very feisty heroine. So Molly Whipple was born in a time when there wasn't a lot of money around, and her parents had lots of children and got more and more desperate at how to make ends meet. And they just, however hard they worked, they just could not make ends meet. So they decided they would have to let go of their 3 younger children, not the 3 older ones, the 3 younger ones. I suppose the 3 older ones would have actually been more able to pretty soon bring bread in themselves. Anyway, they took them out into the woods and left them there. And these 3 young girls go walking through the forest. It's always a forest, isn't it? And finally they come to this big house and go in and knock on the door and say to the woman who answers, could you possibly let us have some food, please? Because we're absolutely desperate and we're really hungry and we've nowhere to sleep. And this, it turns out it's a giant's wife who says, I'm sorry, but my husband, the giant, eats small children, and I don't think it's a good idea for you to come in here. Anyway, they persuade her to let them in, and she hides them in a cupboard, and she says, wait till my husband's had his supper, and then I'll let him know you're here. So they hide in the cupboard, and after he's had his supper and is full up, so he won't want to eat 3 girls. You wouldn't want to tell this to children, would you? She lets him see them, and they agree that the girls can sleep on the bed with their own daughters. And before they all go to sleep, the giant puts gold necklaces on his own daughters' throats and ropes around Molly Whipple and her sisters. Now, Molly is the youngest. This is the interesting thing. It's often the youngest in fairy stories that does the best. I don't know why. And so she notices this thing with the necklaces, and before she goes to sleep, she switches them over. And the giant comes along and cuts the throats of his own daughters because he's stupid enough not to know the difference. And in the meantime, Molly Whipple says to her sisters, we've got to get out of here. So they run away and they go to the king's palace, and Molly says, there's this giant in your realm, your majesty, and you ought not to allow it, really. And he says, what do you want me to do about it, Molly? And she says, well, I think you should get rid of it. And anyway, there's a lot of bargaining goes on, and in the end the king says, so what will you give me if I do this for you? Oh no, she says to the king, if I get rid of the giant for you, No, they agree that the giant's sword is the first thing the king should have. So Molly goes to get the king's sword, the giant's sword, for the king, with the agreement that her older sister will marry his older son. So she manages to get the sword and just about gets away from the giant. And then the king says, I wouldn't mind the purse of, I'd be really okay if I could have the purse of gold that the giant has. So Molly goes off and gets the purse of gold, and that's for the second sister. And the final one is that it's going to be the giant's ring, which is on his finger. And that time Molly comes unstuck because she tries to pull it off. And of course it gets stuck. She does eventually get it off. And the giant is very annoyed with Molly and says, what would you do if I had stolen your ring? And she says, I would lock you up in a sack, tie you up in a sack with a cat and something else. A pair of scissors. That's it. It's a pair of scissors. And anyway, and then I would go and get the biggest stick I could find and come home and beat me to death. So the giant says, oh, that's a good idea. I'm going to do that. And locks her up ties her up in this sack, hands her on a hook. And in the meantime, of course, Molly shouts out to the giant's wife, oh, if you could only see what I can see inside this sack. So she tricks the giant's wife into wanting to come into the sack, opens the sack up, sews up the giant's wife inside the sack. And of course, the giant comes home and beats his own wife up. And Molly gets back with his ring and she marries the king. Now, what I'm going to invite you to do is go out into breakout rooms and spend 10 minutes talking about this story and thinking about what is it that comes to you if Molly Whipple was a client of yours when she has a child of her own, and she has this wonderful story about what a resourceful girl she was and what wonderful things she managed to achieve for her sisters and for herself, and she's a big success. What would happen if she came into your consulting room when she was an adult? Just play around with it a bit. Okay, I'm going to put you in breakout rooms, same as before.
One of the things we spoke about was honouring Molly's defences. You know, she's come in talking about how you said how resourceful she is, and you're sat there as a therapist thinking, oh my goodness, I can't actually believe what's happened to this person, but honouring how she's been able to keep herself safe rather than going in straight away like a bull in a china shop and picking out all of the traumas that she's experienced, building that relationship first, I suppose.
Yeah. Yes, we were just saying it's a perfect example of not what happens, but how you describe it and see it. Yes. And what you focus on. What else did people come up with? I hope you had a bit of fun, really.
Just finishing off where I was thinking at the end of ours, I think she's got an antisocial personality disorder.
Well, actually, that might have something in it. Yes.
Yeah, she's a charming manipulator, you know. She's disregard for and violation of the rights of others. I mean, those giants, they didn't stand a chance when she turned up, did they?
Was it a disorder, or is it a charming manipulator personality adaptation?
Well, yeah, hard to
because and it's about honouring, isn't it?
Yeah.
Honouring is what she had to do to survive, and she did it fantastically well. But it was survival for her.
Mm.
So I suppose it's not about only. So the disorder part is a bit shaming of her, whereas if it's an adaptation that was the best possible option for her to survive, then that can be honoured. And as a charming manipulator myself, I would be really stoked with her and be saying, God, what a great job. It's the other part of her adaptation that she needs the help with.
Yeah, I think I think I'd agree with you with the personality adaptation maybe in the first part of the story, but then by the time she gets to the castle and then starts picking on the giants and saying, no, we've got to go and get rid of them, I think, yeah, there's something a bit deeper going on there, perhaps.
She's also got brilliant skeptic.
Well, yeah.
We were also wondering why she actually ended up in therapy, because she seems quite pleased with herself. And there is potentially the theme of loneliness, and perhaps exploring whether tricking other people is always the best way to survive.
Well, yes, it might be a bit difficult for her to settle down to a more humdrum life, mightn't it? Or perhaps when she had children, she might not be so sure how to be a protective parent.
That's what we picked up on, is that, you know, you've sort of positioned it that she's come to therapy now, she's got kids, and it's sort of like she didn't have a good enough adult. So actually, how can she be a good enough adult now to those girls, or is she still playing out the protective of the sisters, but with her own kids, and it's going down the generation?
Yes, good thinking. That's quite a possibility, I think. Yeah.
Or even she struggled with relationships. She's had early attachment issues. She's been sent off into the forest, and she's not been able to form relationships and not had children. Maybe this is some existential thought that's come to her.
Very good point. Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
We spoke about sort of early abandonment by obviously by her parents, and choosing sort of the two most vulnerable members of the family. And what was just occurring to me as I was listening to people talking was, who were the giants actually? Were they her parents?
Well, certainly the giants weren't a lot more destructive than her parents.
Yeah, I was thinking they're small children, so parents would appear as giants. And
well, that's an interesting thought, yes. However, I do think what the first group said is important, that there's something about how not throwing out the baby with the bathwater, just working out how you can help her keep her sense of agency and competence, but add rather than take away to that, you know, something about adding to that, the capacity to become a good parent or to be more protective of children. Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? But, you know, as I say, there's so much in attachment that you obviously picked up, that I just thought she's quite a good example of someone whose attachment's bound to be compromised, understandably. And hopefully from that, you've got a sense of how we can not only turn clients' stories, well, we can turn clients' stories around by helping them to see the other aspects. It's about what's being ignored and discounted rather than throw away what is being accounted, and how we can help work with people to change their stories into a story that's more encompassing, because I guess most of us during lockdown have managed to healthily discount. I'm thinking about when you hear stories of people who are able to dissociate from the fact they've just accidentally cut their hand off in an accident and can run to a phone box carrying the hand, which you do hear of from time to time, that as human beings, we have the capacity to amazingly discount and dissociate in order to survive. And the question is how we then bring in the accounting without disabling the capacity to survive. That's always the most important thing, isn't it? To help people continue to enhance their life. Whereas other people go for throwing their life away when they don't need to. I remember still, to my horror, a woman when I worked in the social work department of a cancer hospital, and people kept saying, this woman does not need to die. She had a very curable cancer, even at that time. And she just decided she was going to die. And she died. I mean, it was just stunned me. I didn't know about decisions about living or dying at that time. I hadn't done my TA. It was before I met TA. But I've never forgotten this woman's ability to give up on herself. And there are other people who have the most astonishing capacity to hold on to life and have meaning and hold on to its meaning.
But is it giving up on life? Because I don't think of it like that. I think about, having worked with people who do have terminal illness or illness that compromises their ability to enjoy their lives, and the decisions they make about, do you carry on your life but actually have, dreadful side effects, or actually do you say, it's been great and now it's my time?
Yeah, I understand that, and I know that there are people like that, and that's different. This woman did not have a really serious diagnosis that would have had she could have had a good quality of life. So all the medics said.
Right.
And she believed her story that she was terminally ill, and she was terminally ill. It was just phenomenal.
That's what we don't know, Enid, is her story behind that.
Good point.
Of what brought her there in the first place. And
absolutely,
maybe trauma she carried.
So that segues us very neatly into transgenerational trauma and what we might carry from our families and what our clients may carry from our families when we see a story that actually doesn't match the potential of their lives, when people seem not able to see any potential or seem to feel doomed in some way. And as you say, Nick, who knows what that woman was carrying at the time? I wouldn't even have asked because I didn't know about it then. It just still struck me, how sad it was that she could think herself that ill and had such capacity to just go. So when we think about transgenerational trauma, I think every family will have it. That could be hardly anybody. If you go far enough back, you think about right across the world, really. There are wars, famines, natural disasters. One of the things in the British Isles that really always comes home to me is the Irish potato famine, which decimated the population. And I can't see I have an allotment. So when I see potatoes that are affected by blight and they stink and they just collapse, they're awful. There's something absolutely visceral for me in that, not just because I lose my potato crop, I can afford to, but it takes me back to what it must have been like at those times. And the trauma of having to keep going and not being able to have the luxury of feeling your feelings, because you just have to somehow survive as best you can. And of course, people went off to America and all sorts of things like that. And hardly anybody was able to stay at home and survive. So that's just one example. Hayley was talking about the clearances in Scotland. And, so way back, there are things that affected whole communities and uprooted them that might from time to time just crop up. There are the wars. We've all been in touch with the knowledge and memories of the Spanish flu epidemic, and there's something in every family and in many families that will have affected people. And what often happens, if we think about the hot potato theory, which for some people may already have been in my workshop, so forgive me if this is a repeat for you. But for some people, there are issues that have been handed down the family simply because the people at the time didn't know how to deal with them. And whereas Finita talks about the hot potato as something you drop on the next generation, the unlucky recipient, because you don't want to handle it like a hot potato, whew, or pass the parcel. I always think it's a bit like pass the parcel when people toss it quickly along. I don't think of it like that. I think of it that in every generation when there's been trauma, we all survive it as best we can. And so often people don't fully deal with it because they have to just keep alive and keep doing and go on living. So again, it's easy to criticize generations who haven't dealt with their trauma, but they've often been in freeze mode. And what has become very apparent in recent years, thanks to epigenetic research, is that there is genuinely a passing on of memory. There is a change in the gene sequencing when people have experienced severe trauma. And so you do get people in later generations who actually remember something that doesn't belong to them or respond as if something is there that actually isn't there in our generation. And the study that comes to my mind is the study a couple of people did of a group of mice when they exposed them to the smell of cherry blossom, which apparently is a bit almondy, and at the same time gave them an electric shock. And the next generations, subsequent generations of mice, all responded with fear to the smell of cherry blossom, even though they hadn't actually met it and certainly hadn't had the electric shock trauma. And then they implanted eggs they did in vitro fertilization, so that there were then babies born from the mouse eggs of that line, as it were, that were actually, those baby mice were brought up by other mothers, you could say, who hadn't had any connection with the cherry blossom smell. And those babies also showed a reaction of fear, a trauma reaction. So there is something that is understood to be real. We do know that transgenerational trauma genuinely is passed on. It isn't simply by learning or by knowing. And so when as therapists, people have a mysterious memory or a mysterious story to tell us, or a strange image or a voice in their heads, I guess what I'm saying is it's okay to account it that could be a transgenerational issue that they don't fully understand yet. And I'm thinking about a client of mine who was so committed to her life. She'd been working for about 4 years at this point on memories that she'd blotted out of her own sexual abuse when she was 4. And in the middle of the worst of all this, she suddenly started getting the picture of going to sit on a train and then going to a beach and sitting there until she died. And it wasn't until my response as a therapist was, this just is not you. Because she was so committed to living and to getting through things and to resolving things. And when she asked her mother about it, she discovered that a grandmother on her father's side, or I think it was a great grandmother actually, on her father's side, had done exactly that. She got on a train, she got and sat on a beach and died of hypothermia. And that was really one of my earliest experiences of a client who had a most peculiar memory that did not belong to her. and I could give you other examples, but this is about being alive and alert to the strangeness of those stories, and where actually could that belong, and to whom might it, with whom might it have originated. And it may be you've got experiences of your own like that. I mean, for me, it's often about the sheer intensity. Yinka, would you like to share the PowerPoint again so that I can use the PowerPoint for this bit? Okay, so we come down to, okay. So, oopsie, hang on. Yeah. So one of the things about behavior that doesn't belong to the person, but may belong to the family system, is that it's incongruous. So you may get people doing something quite bizarre, like rushing around and buying up tins of beans, or all sorts of things. I can't even think of anything at the moment. And then the question is, where in your family system might this be? Where might it fit? Why might it belong? And this could be something that the person has had all their lives. So it could be inappropriate eating, desperately making sure there's always food in, which could be a relic of the Irish potato famine or of some other time of famine, or a fear of traveling, which could be connected to some previous exodus in the family. You don't never know, but it's about knowing this doesn't belong with this person. Now, hang on, that should have come up first. Okay, so let me just see, hang on. Oh, sorry, Yinka, of course you've got power of it, haven't you? Can you go back to the first one with the color here? Yeah, okay. Okay, and up again. Was that the, okay. Yeah, so hot potatoes might come out more in certain situations. And that really is what I'm thinking of with the lockdown. You know, hot potatoes relating to deprivation, to unexpected early death. You know, we have had so many sad losses as a community, haven't we? Of people that you wouldn't normally expect to go. So, you know, there's been a lot in lockdown, us being locked in, us not being feeling safe amongst other people. That is the kind of thing in which a hot potato might emerge that has been dormant because it's not, as it were, being relevant. You know, it often takes something that triggers it. And it's really important to work out what's my stuff. You know, what is it that's appropriate to this situation? It's natural to be afraid. Fortunately, we're through the worst, but it's natural to be afraid of going out and mixing with crowds. It's natural to be worried if you're with other people who aren't being careful. But so that would be our stuff. But the entanglement would be about something that isn't our stuff, that's somehow coming up, and that is related to this epigenetic inheritance we all hold. Can we have the next one, Yinka? Okay. So feelings belonging to the system, often it is a feeling that will come up first, I think, but they're often not congruent. They're too excessive. They're really disabling. And if you know your client, if there's someone you've been working with for a while, you'll have a sense of whether this seems like something they would feel in this way. And often it's almost as if someone from a previous generation is speaking through them. It will often be described in very extreme language. It's like, I feel like things are going to crash around me, or I'm sorry, I can't even think of the example. Linda, do you want to use the example of that client of yours? No, obviously then I've got the wrong Linda. It's okay.
Sorry, Enid, you talking to me?
Yes, you remember the client that you took some extra supervision on. How
Yeah.
would she have described her worry and not mine? If you think about what sort of language did she use that gave you the clue?
Well, I think she was describing a fear that made no sense in her current life, and it was completely by chance, really. So this was a client that had an anxiety and a phobia about driving, but she completely by chance, she came to a session, and the day before she'd gone to a hospital appointment. She also had a fear of heights and had to walk across a glass walkway. And I asked her, what was your fear? And completely randomly and bizarrely, her fear was that she was going to fall off this glass walkway and that she was going to lose limbs. And it was so specific. And yet she also recognized that she couldn't make sense of it, and neither of us could. But when we explored it, it turned out that her dad's brother, her uncle, who she'd never met, had lost limbs in an industrial accident. And she had a vague memory of being told about that when she was 4 or 5. And so that had become this big thing that, although she hadn't experienced and didn't know, had no first-hand relationship of the person that had experienced it, because he died obviously long before she was born, it represented itself in her own story and anxieties.
And she would have inherited that epigenetically via her father.
Yeah, it was fascinating. And so we were then able, because I had some supervision with you, we were then able to work really quite successfully with that.
Yeah. Thank you, Linda. That's such a good example, you see, of how something will come up unexpectedly and suddenly it all crystallizes that, oh, that's what it's about. But you often have to ask somebody in the system to find out what the heck it's about.
And I think she was responding to that from a very child place, because her experience of it was as a child, as a 5-year-old, being told that the photo of this man was somebody who died in horrific circumstances. So what she actually did alongside the work that we did together was to get the coroner's reports and get some adult information about it, so that she could make a different sense of it.
Which of course we can't always do if it's further back.
No.
That's the thing, but it is helpful to be able to pinpoint, so what might it be about? Okay, Yinka, could we have the next slide? Lovely, thank you. Yeah. So, okay, we've done that, haven't we? So if we go down to the next one. And so entanglement is living as if, which is what Linda's client was doing, as if the fate of someone from the past is ours. In the mistaken belief, somewhere deep within us, the kind of family conscience, you could say, believes that we can somehow lighten our fate and their fate. And this will often happen, that just one specific person in a family will pick this up and will be entangled. Not everybody. Not everybody does it. It's very strange. But as therapists, what's important for us to know is that it isn't helpful to be entangled and to be over involved with somebody else's tragedies. And Hellinger, who taught a lot about working systemically like this, one of the things he said is everyone is responsible for their own fate. This always reminds me of the stories of the Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe. I don't know if people know those stories, but there's a whole series of them. And one constant theme in them that I think really fits with this is that quite often towards the end of each story, Aslan, who's the equivalent of God, I suppose, is talking to one of the characters, and that character will say, and what about so-and-so? And Aslan will always say, oh, that's his story, or that's her story. In other words, you're only responsible for your own. Let me see to that one. But it becomes a kind of transgenerational symbiosis, and it's very hard to work out what's ours and what's that of our ancestors, what belongs to our ancestors. Yeah, okay, thank you, Yinka. So we're now coming back up. I'm going to demonstrate with Yinka, who's very kindly agreed, a fairly simple way of working with people who, if you feel brave enough, which you may not, because some of these things are quite difficult and delicate, but at the same time, it's also very painful seeing people living somebody else's story and disabling themselves. So one of the things you have to be clear about is the person willing to let go? And are all ego states in agreement? Because if not, then the person will know that they're not actually ready. We may think, oh, this isn't yours. It's not a good idea for you to be carrying it. But if the child part of them is so enmeshed with this belief that something terrible will happen if they let go of it, you can't do this particular technique that I'm going to do with Yinka, because the person isn't there yet. They're not ready for it yet. The other question is, do they have a strong enough adult to take up their own life and find out who they are if they let go of this entanglement? The last piece of work I did, I do a lot of work for myself with constellations. I found it an absolutely wonderful way of, as it were, scraping out the bottom of the pit. I don't know how else to describe it, but of getting to the stuff that was there before I was born, which is still affecting me now, and which is a TA therapy, I have to admit, I couldn't so easily and smoothly do. And so I love this way of working. But it's really important to know, is this client ready to let go of this ancestral stuff? Or are they so identified with it that they don't know who they'll be if they let go of it? And they may have to take some time to build that up. Who am I if I were not that? And that might be really important to put in place before the person is ready to let go of this ancestral issue. The other question that's useful is, do they have a picture of the person with whom this issue started? They may not. They may only have a very vague idea. They may know it came to them from their father, their mother, their grandmother, or whatever. I had somebody recently doing this with her grandmother, whose issue was that she never felt enough. But in the process of that, she was very competitive about my client, who had to be the best at everything compared with other people's grandchildren. And so my client was able to say to her grandmother, "Grandmother, you were enough for me." And that took quite a bit of time before it really went incongruently, but it was really important. She let go of this competitiveness because she was picking it up and finding herself being competitive with people. And that was something she was able to identify. She knew it was her grandmother. But it may well be there was stuff further back than that. And sometimes we don't really know where something started. So then what you can do, Yinka, can we have the next slide? Lovely, thank you. Okay. No, I haven't put this in, okay. What I suggest you do, folks, is you can take a picture of a snapshot of this. And then maybe of the next one. But one of the things that I don't think I've put on the slides that you can do is you can get somebody to do that amphitheater of the ancestors. picture their ancestors in an amphitheater and get them in that visualization, just to look and see who would be willing from their ancestors to receive this hot potato back. And you'd be amazed how people often do know, and how powerful and helpful that can be. And then they can do this, what we're going to do together, they can do this with that ancestor. They can do the same process.
That's pretty much what I did with my client, and it was incredibly moving and powerful.
Yes, thank you, Linda. That's lovely. It's lovely that you've done this.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your supervision.
You're welcome. It was a pleasure. So do you want to see what's on the next slide for me, Yinka, if you would? And then, okay, so again, you can take a little snapshot. There are all sorts, because really the key thing is, this is about when the client is ready to let go of what they're carrying, which doesn't any longer belong to them. I think you'll be able to get your PowerPoint as well anyway, but it's useful if you've got it on your picture, and then you can make more sense of it when I'm doing the work with Yinka. I've lost my place. Yes, there are all sorts of ways, and you have to trust that the right words will come. The important thing is that the person first feels comfortable with the ancestor, and that they're put them in a position in their mind's eye, visualize them in a way that they can dialogue. But when they're ready, and that can sometimes take time, you can't always get there the first go. You might need a couple of sessions. You have to go with the pace of the client, and you won't know till you start what that pace is. And you do have to know that you can do this. You have a lot of trust between you and your client. Okay, but these are traditional words that we would use in constellations. Dear mother or grandmother or great grandmother or whatever. I believe this, you can name whatever it is, belongs to you. I've been holding it for you. And with deep respect, I'd like to give it back to you. And then asking for the ancestors' blessing as you find your way forward into a different way of living is also very important. This is a very crash course on a very abbreviated version of doing some individual work with an ancestor. Any questions before we move on? Can we just check the next slide, Yinka? But I think that's the last one.
The last slide, Enid.
Good.
16
Okay.
slides.
That's excellent. Okay, so we'll let go of the PowerPoint if you would. Thank you. Lovely. Okay. So any questions before we move on to this? Because I'm just going to demonstrate it with Yinka's help. I hope I'll be able to pin. I'll have to remember how to pin. Whoosh, let's see. Oh yeah, pin is there. Oh, good. We can pin each other, I think, Yinka, and then there'll just be the two of us on the screen, which should be good. Any questions? Okay, so Yinka's very generously agreed to do this so that
Want to pause the recording?
do you feel you'd like to?
I only raise it as a question.
I'm okay if you are. You're the one that it's important. I'm not going to invite you to tell me what the issue is.
Yeah.
No.
I'm happy for it to be recorded.
Okay, bless you. Right, thank you. It's probably simpler, I think, and also I think more in the spirit of the conference, really. Okay, so I'm going to pin you. Yeah, good. And I think if you pin me, we might come side by side. Shall we see what happens?
Enid, that'll only affect what's on your screen. So if people
Okay.
want to see who's talking, they'll have to put it on speaker view.
Thank you. I'm so glad other people know more than I do about these things. That's really helpful.
Well, if you have it on speaker view, whichever one of you two is talking will be on the screen.
Everybody put it on speaker view then, and then you can see the two of us. But I can see you, Yinka. Can you see me?
I can see you, Enid, yeah.
Okay, that's fine, as long as you and I've got communication. Okay. Okay, so do you know who this issue belongs to? Or
I do, yes.
okay.
Yeah.
So, and it's okay if you want to say who it is, but you don't have to.
Belongs to my mother.
Okay, so I know you were very fond of your mum. So picture your mum, and it often helps just to close your eyes to do this. Visualize your mum in front of you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Does the distance feel right? Or do you want to move back or forwards?
Feels perfect. It's just right.
Okay. And how does she look?
At peace and happy.
Mm-hmm. And if you need to have a conversation with her, because it may be there are some things that you want to say to each other before you move on to really doing what you want to do. So just take your time and see what comes up. And normally I would be asking a client, so, you know, what is being said, or, you know.
What's coming up is my mother is smiling and saying, it's time.
Oh, that's lovely. And how do you feel when she says that?
I feel emotional, and you can probably hear that in my voice, but I also feel happy because it is time.
Lovely. So you both feel that it's time. Yeah. So taking your time over it, see if you can bow to your mum and say in your mind's eye, you don't have to say it verbally. Normally I would invite people to do that, but I think it's fine to just say it in your mind's eye, as it were.
Okay, yeah.
Dear mum, would it be mum, mother, mummy?
Dear mum.
Dear mum.
I know and I believe this belongs to you. It protected you and protected me. But now it's time to let go and to live and to just be.
And how is your mum looking as you say that?
She's standing tall and she's smiling.
See if in your mind's eye you can offer this thing to her physically. Reach out and offer it to her.
Yeah. What I'm doing is I'm placing an object that's dear to her and to me in her hands and passing it back.
And that represents. Yeah. Lovely. And what is she doing with the object?
My mother's always had a bottomless bag.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And she's put it in this bottomless bag and it'll never be seen again.
So there's no sense that she needs to pass it back up the female line.
No, once it goes in the bag, it's gone.
Sounds quite magical.
Yes.
As a matter of interest and completion, can you picture the rest of your female line behind her?
I can, and it's a strong line of strong Black women.
Lovely.
And they're all standing tall, which is important.
Yes. Yeah. So anchor that image in your mind. Yeah.
Yeah.
And in your mind's eye, just gently bow to her and to them. And see if they give you their blessing, which it sounds to me like they would, very happily.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. Breathe deep.
My gran is saying it's about time, kiddo.
I like the sound of your family.
Yeah.
So breathe deep. And see if in your mind's eye you can gently turn round and just feel them behind you so that you face the future.
I feel surrounded by them.
Oh, that's lovely. Yeah.
I'm in the middle and they're all around me and they're all smiling and standing tall.
Wonderful. Lovely. Okay, so when you're ready, gently come back. Take your time because it sounds like that's such a lovely sense of support and delight in you.
I hear your words, but there's an urgency to go out and live and be happy and run in the meadows.
That's just fine. Whatever feels right to you, that's fine. I'm being super cautious for you.
No, it's good. It's good.
Okay.
Good.
And you can just return to that image anytime you want anyway.
It's fantastic.
Well done. Thank you so much, Inka. That's really, really helpful. And I'm delighted with picture in my own mind for your strong Black women surrounding you. I love it. Fantastic. Yeah.
Thank you, Enid. That's been really good.
Oh, thank you 1,000 times. Okay, folks. So, any questions on that?
Can I just apologise? That was me. Someone was trying to ring me through that reattendance.
Oh, no.
I had no control over that. I'm so sorry.
Don't worry, Claire. It was fine.
It was Linda.
Linda, was it? Sorry.
Yeah. I'm a bit mortified about that. Sorry.
Well, I didn't find it distracting. Did anybody else? And it came.
I didn't know that somebody could do it.
It came. I didn't either, but it came at a perfect time because we'd just about done, hadn't we?
Just as well. Sorry about that.
Yeah.
I was already on my bike, cycling to the meadows. So hey,
brilliant.
I'd gone. Yeah.
And I can see that everyone's really touched. And of course, one of the lovely things about that is it's a very simple way of letting go of a part of our story that's held us back. But the additional bit of the story is the ancestors are always very, very willing to take it back. And that's the beautiful thing about that work, that if I'm doing a constellation and you've got people representing members of your family, it's like, I have never yet had an ancestor who said, I don't want to take it back. It's always like, that's my trauma. It's dealt with. It's in the past. Get on with your life. So, yeah, although they're not always quite so joyful as Yinka's ancestors appear to be.
Enid, can I ask you a question? What would you do if somebody's ancestors didn't give a blessing?
Sorry, speak up a bit, Sarah.
I'm just thinking, what would happen if, you know, the person's towards the end of the work, but the ancestors won't give the blessing?
There's always a way. Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't encourage you to do a lot of this with your clients, but there may be clients with whom you feel okay to do it. I think you can usually get a sense of whether the ancestors would be willing. If the ancestors aren't willing to give the blessing, usually there'll be something they need to do. There's some problem further back that hasn't been addressed. So you might say something like, well, I see that your descendant is going to move forward. It would be lovely if they can do it with your blessing. And I hope one day you'll feel able to give it or something. I'd find a way to do it. But usually before I do that sort of work, I would have a bit of a feeling with somebody about what was in their ancestry. I always, when I see clients, I always ask them about their system, basically, because when people are moaning about their mothers or their fathers, and I say, so what sort of childhood did they have? You know, you often find the issues that come down the line. Or if they aren't willing to take it or give the blessing, there's usually something else happening. So you might go back to it. It's difficult for me to, that's such a general question. It's all specific to each family sort of thing, So it might be just there's other work to be done another time. But the thing is, this is about letting go. So your client can let go, even if the other is not willing to pick it up. It's more complete if the other's willing to pick it up and gives the blessing, but the client can let go anyway. Because the truth is, we don't have to live our ancestors' traumas. Sorry, somebody was trying to say something.
I was just going to ask, if you had time in the relationship with the client, would you use any like chair work to then do an intervention with the ancestor that won't let go, or would you keep it specifically about the client and keep the ancestors out?
Not so much chair work. What you can do is placement mats. So you might put people's names on a piece of paper or something, and then set out the family system that way, like you would in a family constellation. I mean, I've done workshops on this, but today that's not the main focus. It's more about story. But you might then get the client to stand on each place and see what comes up for them in that place. Yes, and it might be there's other work to be done in different parts of the system. Quite often this is only a part. But the essential bit about this work is we don't have to hold on, blessing or no blessing. We have a choice when we become aware we're carrying somebody else's trauma. So then we have to think creatively as the therapist who has the best will of the client, best intention for the client. We have to think, well, how can we support them in actually letting go of that and leaving somebody in the family to pick it up? There'll almost always be somebody who comes in to pick it up. And somebody who will give the blessing. So sometimes a parent is too traumatized to give a blessing, and it may be another ancestor further back will come and support them in the image. You just have to know what you want to achieve that's helpful to the client, but the essential bit is for the client to let go, and they have choice about that. The other doesn't have to receive it for them to let go. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, thank you.
But it's a very good question. I mean, things can go wrong, but surprisingly rarely, really. And you wouldn't do this work usually unless you had a fair idea that it was going to work out, you'd have a fair idea of what happened, what the system's like. I have had somebody whose mother refused to talk to her in that image. And I got her to say to her mother, "You are my mother, whether you like it or not. And I am your daughter, whether I like it or not." And that actually made a lot of difference, because it's like everyone in the system has their place. And they couldn't deny their relationship, whether they wished to or not.
And I guess with what you're saying about stories as well, before you do an intervention like this, you'd be working with stories.
Yes.
And I found with my own personal development that the more I develop and let go of things myself, the more accepting of others' limitations I can be. So to do that work now, I'd have the frame of compassion to why that may have been that point. Whereas early on in therapy, you wouldn't use something like this while there's still that lack of understanding.
Yeah, compassion is really important for the client themselves and for the people in the system.
Yeah.
And that's what you develop, enormous compassion when you're working with a family system, because you can really see why it's in such a pickle. Okay, I'm afraid it is time, folks. Shall we just take a few minutes to think what your takeaways might be? And you don't have to, but anybody who wants to say what their takeaways will be from the workshop. I'm afraid it's been a bit of a skitter and a run around. Thank you, Alan.
I'm very eager to learn more about constellation work, Enid. That's my takeaway.
Okay.
Thank you.
I am doing a training in the autumn for a group that have been waiting for quite a long time on.
You have indeed.
Constellations. Yes, you have indeed. Absolutely.
Come on, Paul, join in.
I will.
So just email me if my email's there. Anybody who wants to follow it up. Yeah.
Just thinking, Enid, living in Nottinghamshire at the moment, what a rich scene to mine.
Oh, lovely. Yes, that's a lovely image.
I've loved the workshop today. Thank you so much, Enid. I can see why people rave about your workshops. It's lovely. I've got too much to take away that I could possibly tell you all about. So, but particularly that last exercise, and just I think permission for me to be more creative and to be, I don't know, less rigid. I think about the way that I practice is lovely. Thank you.
Lovely. Really good to hear. You go for it. Yeah.
Thank you, Enid. I've really enjoyed it as well. Made lots of notes and I'm looking forward to reflecting on it. Thank you.
If anyone has any queries afterwards, feel free to email with them. I'm quite happy to follow up if there's something I wasn't able to completely bottom, which obviously there's a lot I wasn't able to completely bottom. and if you think, oh, I wonder about, I'm fine for you to contact me afterwards. So feel free to do that.
Enid, I really love your energy. Thank you. I'm really loving being around people with high energy this weekend because it's not how I feel, but it's wonderful to see that embodied. So thank you.
Thank you. Lovely.
Thanks, Enid. I've really enjoyed it, and I have to rush because I'm required elsewhere for closing remarks. So.
I'm sure you are, and we'll all have to come and rush, won't we? So yeah. Thank you, David, for your presence.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to say anything? I do want to say you've been a lovely group to work with, and I was really worried after yesterday about the cohesion of the group, but I've really felt you all very present here, and it's just been lovely. I've really enjoyed that.
Thank you, Enid. It's been lovely as usual, and your energy in an afternoon slot is very much appreciated, I think.
Thank you.
And felt.
Well, I've learned to have compassion for my energy rather than and celebrate it.
It's wonderful. I wish I could bottle it.
Enid, I'm taking away love, peace and calm. And if we were in the room together, this would be the stage where I would just start clapping and saying thank you for another fantastic workshop.
Oh, well, thank you, Yinka, for all you've given me in supporting me. It's been absolutely wonderful.
My pleasure.
Can we all clap anyway, even though we're not together?
Yes.
Right.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Enid.
Lovely.
Thank you, Enid.
Thank you, Enid. Thank you, Inka.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Inka, as well.
Thank you.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you, Yinka. Thank you, Enid. It's been a pleasure. Thanks.
It's been lovely. Thank you.
Bye.
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 Lovely to see you again.
Lovely to see you. Bye.
Bye.